Hello, everyone. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ellen de Bruin. I'm a reporter at NRC, the news outlet formerly known as NRC Handelsblad, where I write about all things weird and wonderful. I'm also a writer of novels. The latest one is Kraaien in Paradijs, in which I try to sell a very bleak worldview in a combination with a bit of humor. Welcome to Spui 25, the scholarly and cultural platform that brings hundreds of free lectures every year to the general public. Lectures on science, arts, literature, politics. Spui 25 is now in its 15th year. It's an anniversary year. And tonight I present to you the fourth and final anniversary lecture by Merlin Sheldrake on Entangled Life, the hidden world of fungi. And please let me introduce him to you a bit. Merlin Sheldrake is a biologist, he's a writer, he's a public speaker. He has a PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama. And he wrote this wonderful book, Entangled Life, translated into Dutch by Nico Groen, a very beautiful translation as Verweven, leven. A book that covers topics ranging from plants and microbiology and ecology to the history and philosophy of science. It's an absolute page-turner. I loved it so much. And it's all about fungi. It's all about yeasts and molds and mushrooms. It's about the stuff that makes your bread go green and your strawberries go white and then black after that. The life forms that make your beer and wine and miso and that produce your shiitake mushrooms and your truffles. Merlin is a brewer and a fermenter and a mushroom grower himself. He illegally made cider from Newton's apples, and he called it gravity. He is currently working on the first release of his own fermented hot sauce, and he has eaten a copy of his own book, and it's not a thin book, by eating the oyster mushrooms that he grew on it. He's also a piano player, and he plays the accordion, but sadly that is not going to happen tonight. So, this is what is going to happen tonight. First, Merlin will give a lecture about his book and about fungi. Next, I will ask him a couple of questions. Then Ramsey Nasr will come to the stage. And we all know Ramsey Nasr. He is an actor and poet. He's winner of 2 Louis d'Ors for his roles in The Fountainhead and as Jude in Hanya Yanagihara, A Little Life, Een Klein Leven. Ik denk dat veel mensen dat hebben gelezen. Many people will have read that. He also won a Gouden Kalf for the role of Ischa Meijer in the television series after Connie Palmer's novel E.M. And he's a former poet laureate, dichter des vaderlands, and a winner of the Gouden Ganzenveer, the Golden Quill, very Harry Potter, among other prizes. And last year he published De Fundamenten, a critical essay about our Western way of living. So Ramsey was inspired by Merlin Sheldrake's book, and he will tell a bit more about that later on. He will give a very special performance with the rietkwintet Calefax. That is a world-famous ensemble. They call themselves a classical ensemble with a pop mentality. They have been playing together and touring for 37 years now. They arrange and play music spanning the entire history of classical music on hobo, clarinet, saxofoon, bass clarinet en bassoon. Dat is fagot, ik vergeet het altijd, bassoon. They especially love collaborations with other musicians and performers. And they will be playing in Amsterdam another 2 times this year in Muziekgebouw aan het IJ. They have a Roaring Twenties program on November 23rd and a variety show on November 28th. Check their website, and they will be selling their CDs afterwards. But first, give a warm welcome to Merlin Sheldrake.
Thank you all for coming on a Monday night. I don't do very many things on a Monday night, so I appreciate that you've taken the time to come out in this cold weather. It's a great treat to be here in Amsterdam. I love to be here. I have dear friends here. I have close collaborators here. And so it's always a wonderful thing to be here. So I'm happy as well. And today I was lucky enough to go to the Artus Library. And in this place, I was lucky enough to hold and read, or at least not read, but to look at the pictures of a book of Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who many of you may have heard of. And he did some very important things. And one of the things he did nearly 300 years ago was to make microscopes. Microscopes out of small beads of glass, which he could hold up to his eye. There was a replica of one of his microscopes there today. And I tried to use it, looking through this tiny pinhole, screwing up my eye and my face, and I just couldn't do it at all. And I've heard a lot in the past about how difficult these instruments were to use. But nonetheless, he used them, and what he saw under the magnification that these glasses provided was a world that humans had not seen before. A world of small organisms moving around. He called them animalcules, little animals. And we now call these microbes. Microorganisms. And these microorganisms make up a subvisible world which is hugely important. Microbes have been here long before humans. They'll be on the planet long after humans. They've created the planet that we know. They live in and on us. They allow us to do the things we do and behave in the ways that we behave. We carry around more microbial cells than our own cells. This whole astonishing branch of science was started by Leeuwenhoek, and it was a great thrill to look at these objects and look at these pictures today. Because what this branch of science has showed us and continues to show us is that there's no such thing as a single, isolated, individual organism. All organisms live in intimate, reciprocal dependence with other organisms, sometimes larger, very often smaller. That there's no way you can think about an organism and try to understand an organism in isolation from the place in which it lives and the other organisms with which it lives. That biology, the study of living organisms, is melting into ecology, the relationships between living organisms, the intermingled meshwork out of which all organisms arise. So the worldview that this presents us with is a worldview of entanglement, of a place where everything is so inextricably interconnected that our concepts of individuality, autonomy, independence, these concepts start to look almost ridiculous. And indeed, as a biologist looking at the living world, it becomes clear that it's not very easy to define what an individual is at all. When I was working in Panama, there was one glorious event, a microbe conference, and all of the nerds who studied tropical microbes got together in a darkened room and spent 3 days talking with each other and having dinner with each other. And sharing their ideas and discoveries. And one of these moments that I remember very vividly, someone got up to talk about a type of plant that we know partly by the type of chemical that it produces in its leaves. This type of chemical is a diagnostic feature of this type of plant. And he said, actually, it's not the plant that produces this chemical. It's the fungus that lives in the leaves of the plant. And so then there we were thinking, well, if the chemical is a piece of the plant's identity and it's being produced by a fungus that lives in the plant, then the fungus must be a part of the plant's identity too. And then someone said, well, I don't think it's the fungus. I think it's the bacteria that live inside the fungus, that live inside the plant. And then someone said, no, I think it's the viruses that live inside the bacteria, that live inside the fungus, that lives inside the plant. And this is a very familiar situation for anyone working with microbes and microbial ecology. And it's a really exciting place to be. It's a confusing place to be. And a lot of what I talk about tonight will come from this place of ambiguity and confusion and relational interminglement. And it's important, I think, to point out that although many of these ideas we've been led to them by discoveries in the modern sciences, that the worldview that we are left with, the worldview of relationship being the primary unit of the living world being a vast network of reciprocal, intimate relations, that this is a very old idea. This is found in many, many, many traditional knowledge systems all around the world. And so I think of this as more a remembering than a discovery. And it couldn't come a moment too soon, in my view. So fungi are a kingdom of life. And kingdom is a broad category. Kingdom is as broad a category as animals or plants. But fungi are a kingdom of life which have not had a kingdom's worth of attention. Partly because they were only designated a kingdom in the late 1960s, which is when they won their independence. And since then, all sorts of strange things have started to happen, as you would imagine, after fungi have won their independence. Again, it couldn't come a moment too soon, in my view. So when we think about fungal lives, we are often led into strange places because their lives are so strange and so other. And indeed, one of the things that I feel strongly and that motivates a lot of my work and my inquiry is that thinking about fungi makes the world look different. And partly this is the case because although when we think of fungi we normally think of mushrooms, most fungi don't live their lives as mushrooms. Only a very small number of fungal species produce mushrooms, a small proportion rather of the overall number of fungal species. And even the fungi that produce mushrooms only produce mushrooms for a small moment every year. And most fungi live most of their lives as mycelial networks, or mycelium, which are branching networks of tubular cells that grow from their tips and branch and fuse with each other and form complex networks, dynamic networks, transport networks, through which chemicals can pass, through which water can pass. These are networks that are able to burrow into their surroundings using high pressure and by producing any number of chemicals, enzymes and acids that allow some fungi to burrow into solid rock, other fungi to eat crude oil, some types of plastic, recalcitrant hydrocarbons that poison the soil, but also wood. And some specialist fungi live in Canadian distilleries on the fumes, the alcoholic vapors that evaporate from whiskey barrels as they age. Fungi are metabolically ingenious and make their life as mycelium by digesting their surroundings. This is what they do. And what this means is that so much of the world around us is perfused by mycelium. Mycelium is a kind of a living seam by which much of life is stitched into relationship. If we could see the mycelium all around us, you would see it everywhere. You would see it through the soil, tangling through the bodies of animals and plants, whether alive or dead. You'd see fungal mycelium in rubbish dumps, in sulfurous sediments at the bottom of the ocean, in coral reefs, in the bodies of crabs and lobsters, and in the canvases of old master paintings hanging in museums. These mycelial networks are sensitive bodies. They live their lives bathed in a rich field of sensory information. They're sensitive to chemicals, to acidity, to light, temperature, pressure, any number of stimuli, and they're able to integrate these different data streams through their rambling bodies, and they're able to make decisions about the right course of action, where to grow, how fast to grow, what chemicals to produce to digest this substrate, what chemicals to produce to influence this animal's behavior, what chemicals to produce to change the branching pattern of this plant's roots. Any number of things that fungi can do. And they're able to do all these things without having a brain. There's no center of a fungal network. There's no brain, there's no heart. And this is really strange for us to deal with. At least it's strange for me to deal with. Because I've been taught that our brains are vitally important for all of the basic things that we do, as are our hearts. You cut off my head and I'm finished, and you stop my heart and I'm finished. So how is it, it would always strike me, that fungi are able to coordinate their bodies over sometimes very large distances? Some of the largest known organisms are fungal networks, which sprawl over kilometers. How are they able to coordinate themselves, but without having a brain, without having a heart? And this remains a big riddle, a big mystery, because it's not very easy for us to understand this kind of life form. There's no one place where anything happens. Everything happens a little bit everywhere and a little bit nowhere in particular. So trying to understand fungal life is filled with confusion, which is fun. At least fun when you learn to endure ambiguity, which I think is healthy. And so fungal mycelium can perform all sorts of amazing feats. Mycelium lives in crowded environments, complex rotscapes in the soil. And when researchers challenge mycelial networks with small labyrinths, the fungal mycelium can grow through the labyrinths and quickly find the shortest path between the entrance and the exit. This is good for humans to see. We use mazes and labyrinths as ways to assess the intelligence of all sorts of creatures, whether humans or rats or octopuses. And so by inviting fungi to demonstrate this kind of behavior to us, it starts to let us into the world of what they can do. But from a fungal point of view, these laboratory mazes are nothing special. They live in hugely complex environments. A mycorrhizal fungus, a fungus that has symbiotic relationships with plant roots, might sprawl over tens of meters, be connected to the roots of 10 or 15 different plants, engaging in sophisticated trading relationships with each of these plants in slightly different ways, digesting one thing over here, another thing over here, negotiating relationships with bacteria which travel along the walls of its body to get around the soil, like a highway system, negotiating with bacteria living inside it and viruses living inside it. And so the little laboratory maze isn't such a big challenge. Fungi are able to hunt. Some fungi have evolved to hunt nematode worms. They can produce only when they're hungry, only when they need nitrogen, which is produced by, which they get from eating nematode worms. They produce nooses, little circular rings that attract nematodes towards them. When the nematode swims through the noose inflates in 1/10 of a second, trapping the nematode and allowing the fungus time to grow through its mouth and digest it from the inside. Some fungi produce mobile cells that swim through the soil towards nematodes, which they're attracted to. They stick to the nematode when they reach the nematode, and then they harpoon the nematode with special cells that are called gun cells, and then they digest the nematode. So these are grisly patterns of behavior, which I'm sharing just to illustrate some of the things that these organisms can do. So when we now imagine again the mycelial networks growing through the soil, through the bodies of animal plants, through the trees, through the surface of the sea floor, and through the paintings, we imagine not a static network, but a growing network, a network that's constantly remodeling itself, that's responding to its surroundings, that it's producing and actively intervening in its surroundings. And the extent to which fungi actively intervene in their surroundings is world-changing, world-making, and biosphere-maintaining. Fungi are prodigious decomposers. And if fungi didn't decompose wood, for example, the planet would pile up kilometers deep in unrotted forests and grasslands. And likewise with animal bodies. Although there wouldn't be plants or animals were it not for the fungi that helped them exist in the first place, but just as a thought experiment. And so we live and breathe in the space that fungal decomposition lives behind. This is hugely important for so many reasons. And it's not just decomposition that fungi are influential in doing. Fungal mycelium is so closely embedded in its surroundings, and it's so closely embedded in the lives of other organisms. And fungal relationships, fungal symbiotic relationships, have shaped the history of life and continue to shape life today. Fungi, in this sense, are, by forming physical networks between organisms, they're, in some sense, ecological poster organisms. They embody the basic principle of ecology, which is the connections between different organisms, the connections between different organisms and the place in which they live. And many of these relationships have been blockbuster relationships in the history of life. One is close to my heart, plants and the relationships they form with fungi that live in and around their roots. And the fungi that live in and around their roots grow out into the soil in their complex networks. And they forage for nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus. And then they trade these nutrients with their plant partners. And the plants provide the fungus with energy in the form of fats and sugars that it's produced in photosynthesis. And these trading relationships underlie all terrestrial life that we see around us. When you walk into a forest, you're seeing the visible outgrowth of fungal relationships taking place below the ground. This is a relationship that evolved very, very long time ago. And indeed, it's thanks to these fungi that the ancestors of land plants, which were freshwater algae, that these algae were able to move onto the land in the first place when they started to wash up on the soggy shores of lakes and rivers about 500 million years ago. They were faced with whole new challenges. They were faced with a challenge of how to find nutrients in these young soils. They were not adapted to this. Life in the water is like living in a soup. The nutrients you need come to you. All you have to do is photosynthesize. And so it seems that these early algae were only able to make it onto the land by forming relationships with fungi that behaved as the root systems of these early plants. And they behaved as the root systems of the early plants for tens of millions of years until plants could evolve their own roots. So roots follow fungi into being. And these fungal relationships are a more fundamental part of planthood, a more ancient part of planthood than leaves or fruit or flowers or wood or any of the things that we so often think of as very basic plant traits. There are many, many other fungal relationships that have shaped and continue to shape life, but I won't go into them all here. But the way we think about these relationships, I think, is very interesting and important. And we can think about these relationships in lots of different ways. If you think about a plant and its fungi, it's tempting to think about one organism and its relation to another organism. They come together, they relate to each other. They can relate to different organisms, they can relate to these organisms, but we could draw it schematically as organism A, organism B, and you could draw a line between them. But it's less like this in reality. It's more like these organisms create each other through their relationship. It's more like a dynamic interplay that these organisms are so pivotal to the life of these others that take away this organism, and this organism could not exist at all. In fact, it wouldn't have evolved at all. I started to see this a little bit like the picture by Escher, M.C. Escher, the drawing hands, where one hand is drawing the other hand, drawing the hand, drawing the hand, and you have this wonderful regress, a co-creative regress. And I really think that this is a more healthy metaphor to think about symbiotic relationships. And indeed the whole living world, that this is a state of organisms making each other through their relationships. It's very difficult for us to think about the relationships more than the organisms doing the relating. But I think indeed that's what we need to be trying to do to better understand these complex ecological systems. So there are lots of ways that fungi and humans relate. There are lots of ways that fungi and humans have related in this drawing hands way. There are lots of ways that humans do what they do because their past relationships with fungi allowed them to do what they do. Whether it's in the making of bread or beer, or in the production of vital drugs that save countless lives. Penicillin is a very famous case, but there are many others. Whether in our efforts to cultivate plants. Every time we cultivate a plant, we're cultivating fungal relationships, whether or not we think about it. Forestry, in agriculture, gardens. In all of these places, we are living within fungal relationships. There are new fungal technologies that might allow us to build leather-like materials or construction materials and disrupt polluting and troublesome industries. There are many, many ways that we can partner with fungi. There are many ways we can remember old partnerships with fungi as we look forward to the future of life on a damaged planet. So there I will stop, and we now have a chat. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I've got so many questions. Well, first, let me cite some things to you from the book. You use a lot of what I like to call to the moon and back comparisons, and I'll quote some. In the truffle chapter, you say, a human nose can smell some substances in the concentration of 34,000 molecules on a square centimeter, the equivalent of 1 drop of water in 20,000 Olympic swimming pools. Another example, there are hyphae that can penetrate Kevlar. If such a hyphae were as big as a human hand, it could lift an 8,000 kilogram bus. Mycorrhizal hyphae, schimmeldraden, are 50 times as thin as the thinnest plant roots and can be 100 times as long. Their total in the upper 10 centimeters of soil are half as long as our solar system. Well, I could go on and on.
Please don't go on and on.
Is this the way your brain works, or is this the way fungi make you think about the world?
So I'm not sure how my brain works. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't work at all. But it is the way that fungi have invited me to try and understand the world. And these ridiculous comparisons are ways to revel in what they can do and to try and make it intelligible, because their lives are so remote, feel so remote sometimes, even though we live in great intimacy with them, really. That sometimes we need these comparisons as a way to sit up and pay attention and remember that they're doing remarkable things all the time that we can only imagine. And
well, what would your main emotions be toward fungi? Is it love, or is it awe, or maybe is it complicated, like some relationships on Facebook are? How would you describe it?
Well, you know, it's quite easy to forget that fungi are a whole kingdom of life, that there are lots of ways to be a fungus. It's a bit like saying what's one's relationships towards plants in general, or animals in general. And if it were animals in general, then there are many, many animals that I'm fascinated by, that I would love to get to know more. And there are also animals that I would definitely not like to get too close to. And there are animals that cause great problems for humans and for other organisms. So with fungi, it's a bit like that. I feel a lot of respect for these organisms. I feel a lot of awe, that's for sure. And I feel deeply curious about them as well. And some of them I feel great affection for.
Which ones?
Well, I like there's a mushroom called hericium, or lion's mane, and it produces the most elegant fruiting bodies with kind of teeth that drape like a waterfall or like a coral. And not only is it a very elegant fungus, but it makes me want to sort of touch it. It's kind of adorable, like, you know. I don't want to be patronizing to it, but I want to move towards it when I see it.
Yeah.
You know?
Do you like, in general, the mushroom-producing fungi more than the non-mushroom producing ones?
Well, no, I mean, I don't like to, you know, I don't like to choose. But I do have a lot of time for the ones that don't produce mushrooms, because those are the ones that I spent most of my time researching. Some mycorrhizal fungi produce mushrooms, like Boletus or chanterelle, but many of them don't. And the ones that I studied most of all didn't produce mushrooms. And it was so fascinating, you know, because I'd be walking around the forest in Panama, and the mushrooms give you at least a little way in. They give you a little clue, you know, they give you something to touch or to smell. But the ones I was studying really didn't. And so I had to start thinking of the trees around me and the shrubs around me as expressions of the relationships that I was studying.
You were treating trees as mushrooms, basically.
Well, no, I was thinking about the tree from a fungal point of view. Yeah, no, I don't want to be rude to trees either.
But could you see when you started to dig, could you see the mycorrhiza? Could you?
Not with my naked eyes, but I could take little bits of soil back to the lab, and I could extract the spores from the soil, and then you could see them. They look amazing, beautiful, like fish eggs, like caviar, or like jewels.
Are there some fungi that you fear?
Certainly, yes. There are many disease-causing fungi that I certainly wouldn't want to succumb to. There are fungal superbugs that we're creating, really, by overuse of fungicides, and we're not adequately preparing for the consequences. There are fungi that cause devastating diseases of plants and would kill much of the food that I might eat in a year, you know, if given the right conditions. There are fungi that destroy forests, and will continue to destroy forests at a greater rate, because climate change is increasing, changing the envelopes in which these organisms live, and so new fungal pathogens can move into new places where the trees don't have resistance and cause all sorts of problems. This is happening right now in England with ash trees, which are dying back and may go extinct in England because of a fungal pathogen. So there's plenty of fungi that I am scared of. Yeah.
I was reading also you just told us about the nematode worms that were eaten by fungi, and it was like, well, as if they were a slice of bread and were just molded over with the. And I felt like maybe something like that could happen to humans if we don't watch out, if we use too many fungicides, or if we. Do you think that could happen? Could fungi take over all of humanity?
Well, I mean, I don't think they take over all of humanity. I mean it's be like with any other set of relationships. You know, some people might succumb to a fungal disease, others might survive. We might find ways to defend ourselves. I think it's unlikely that one fungal superbug would tear through humanity and make us extinct in a short space of
It
time.
makes me think of Japanese horror films or horror manga, in which that could happen. And do you think fungi could save humanity by, well, you just told us a bit about a construction material made of fungi. Maybe fungi can get rid of, well, all kinds of substances we don't want to have in the air or in the soil. Are you optimistic about fungi saving humanity and maybe combating climate change?
So I prefer to think about it as the ways that we can form relationships with fungi might help us to adapt. The language of saving I find troublesome because it's a bit much like a Hollywood movie, you know, saving the world.
And it's separating us from the fungi.
Totally, and it's just looking for another hero, you know, in a story. And the situation is far more complex than that because we're talking about vastly diverse ecologies, and there's no one hero. The hero paradigm, I think, is ill-suited to the complexity of the biosphere. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is that there are many ways that fungi can cause problems for us and will cause problems for us, and there are many ways that fungi might help us solve problems, and indeed they have done both of these things throughout human history, and indeed through the whole history of fungi with other organisms besides humans. So I think we have an opportunity to form generative relationships with fungi, and we have an opportunity to miss that chance, and I hope we take the former.
And you think now is the moment to do something about that, to start those relationships?
Yeah, and indeed to remember that we already have those relationships.
Yeah.
You know, it's like with plants, for example. Much of industrial agriculture in the 20th century evolved without thinking very much about the life in the soil, treating the soils as more or less dead places, and that germs or that microbes in the lives of plants were, on the whole, troublesome parasites or pathogens. And so a lot of the ways that we farm, a lot of the ways that we practice forestry are blind to fungal life, are blind to the lives of the microbes in the soil, from which all life springs, in fact. And so I think we can start to remember some of these things, and so to stop some of our destructive practices because of what they do to fungal life.
And how is that playing out in science right now? Are more and more people acknowledging that this is what should happen, or is there enough funding for? Well, there's never enough funding for fungi research, but is it are fungi having a moment, or?
I think fungi is certainly having a moment, and I think there are lots of reasons for that. One is that we know more about them than we used to, because new technologies like DNA sequencing allow us to work out who's living where and what's who doing here and what's who doing there. But also, I think we know more about them because as the ecological crises around us have worsened, people have become more aware of the networks of interrelationship and interdependence in which we're embedded. And fungi are poster organisms for ecological thinking. They're living networks, and they speak to us, I think, at this time. But also they speak to us at this time because of the network zeitgeist in which we live. You know, networks have stopped just being physical networks like the internet, but network thinking and network science, network models are used in so many different branches of human inquiry. And again, fungi are kind of poster organisms for network thinking, network awareness. And so I think they also speak to us on that level too. And there are many more reasons, I think. Partly also, in fact, the psychedelic, the resurgence of interest in psychedelics, I think, is contributing as well, because much of that's taking place with psilocybin, which is a fungal compound. I think fungi are certainly having a moment. But I work with an organization called the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, or SPUN. I mean, indeed, this is why I come to Amsterdam sometimes to work with my collaborator, Toby Keers, at the VU. And what we're trying to do at SPUN is to make maps of mycorrhizal communities around the world. We're trying to make these maps because we want to provide a way for people to take the life underground into account when they are making conservation policy decisions, when making new laws. Because at the moment, most of the world of conservation governance and practice takes place based on what you can see above ground. And we're missing a huge part of the picture. So we're working both to do the science, but also to raise awareness and to start to try and bend the curve towards systems of ecological intervention where we remember that the organisms that we depend on aren't just the organisms that we can see. And that's hard work. And so I would say that the fungi might be having a moment, but still there's a lot of work to be done.
If you say making a map, could you put a percentage on how large a part of that map is still black?
We can do this quite easily with this picture, where you can put a dot where the samples that we have data from are. Most of the world does not have a dot on it, that's for sure. But we're working with really powerful analyses and brilliant data scientists who are using machine learning to predict fungal diversity based on other factors, based on environmental factors, land use factors, all sorts of things. And then we are making these predictive maps, and then we are ground truthing them by going to different places to see, indeed, is what is happening here in the ground, what the map said was happening here in the ground, and then updating the map, and then updating the map and updating the map with increasingly large numbers of samples until we have a map that is robust enough to form the basis of decision makers' decisions. So it's a large piece of work, but I think it's a bit like Alexander von Humboldt, his maps of, his vegetational maps of altitudinal gradients and plant communities. These are schematic maps that he made, which changed the way that people thought and imagined. They changed the way that people did science. They changed the kinds of inquiries that were possible to make. We live all of our lives, whether or not we think about Humboldt, we live all of our lives in space, the imaginal space created by some of the maps that he made. And this is the kind of thinking that we're putting into these underground maps of fungal communities, to try and deepen and expand the way we think, feel, and imagine.
And if we start using fungi, if we will be able to use fungi to save us from some kinds of climate disasters, to what extent do you think that would be ethical to use those organisms? I mean, if you compare it to industrial farming of animals, of livestock, to what extent do you think it's ethical to use fungi for our own purposes? Or maybe that is also the wrong question because it's not a relationship perspective, but...
I mean, you can think about these things in so many ways. No, I think it's a fine question to ask. I think we should actually be asking these questions because whenever we form relationships with organisms, there's the opportunity to do it in an extractive and destructive way, and there's an opportunity to do it in some kind of way which is regenerative to all the parties involved. And we see this with the way that we work with plants and have worked with plants for an unknowably long time. In the case of fungi, I actually sometimes like to think about it as, we can think about it as us domesticating the fungi, but I actually think that sometimes it helps to think about it the other way around, like the fungi are domesticating us. When I went to visit a massive facility in New York State where they're making material out of fungi, and they had tons of agricultural waste, tons of this stuff showing up in lorries. They had big conveyor belts and screws that it went through, and it was being pasteurized. And then they inoculated fungi into this perfect food, exactly what the fungus wanted to eat. And tons of the stuff. I mean, more stuff than the fungus could, if it was a human, than it ever would have imagined. And it's being served by these humans, and human industry is being created to serve it. It's true that before these items go on to be used in buildings that the fungus has killed, but not before it's being propagated into another batch, a huge batch of wood chips. So I think there are lots of ways in which these relationships are really, it can be helpful to see them as these two-way processes where actually we might not be the only ones being agents.
So what about, you mentioned psilocybin, the stuff that makes magic mushrooms magical. Do you think that those mushrooms and those fungi might be controlling us, maybe on a larger level? Are they tricking us into using them? And have they been doing that for ages?
Well, this has been a source of puzzlement and speculation for a very long time. My view is that what we're seeing right now, since the 50s, is a whole new relationship starting to form between humans and some species of tropical mushroom. These mushrooms have been used by traditional societies in Central America for an unknowably long time. They may well have been used by humans in other parts of the world in deep prehistory, although we don't know exactly where or when or how. But today, something different is happening. Today, in warehouses, on shelves in people's bedrooms, under their beds, in wardrobes and cupboards, a handful of tropical mushroom species are finding a home in otherwise inhospitable climates. And that's because the effect they have on our mind is so strange and enticing that we choose to cultivate them in this way. And so I think in that sense, you can see a remarkable new domestication relationship arising. Whether or not the fungi are controlling our minds is rather a different question. I mean, certainly when we eat a magic mushroom, the mushroom is not going on to live inside our bodies, as it does when certain types of fungus control insect behavior and live inside their bodies and puppet their every move, force them to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, override their deepest and most ancient instincts.
But they have that effect on our psyche, don't they?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, one could think of it like that. It's true that we certainly feel in new ways, experience our minds in new ways, experience our relationships in new ways. I don't know, though, that one could say that it's the fungus controlling us, because the fungus is, as I say, living its life outside us, and you can elicit these experiences with just psilocybin, which is a small part of the mushroom. So certainly these mushrooms impact human societies and cultures, and have done for a long time. And who knows how that will change as we move forward.
And would you recommend trying it?
I don't recommend. I try not to recommend anything. I know lots of people who have had very, very helpful times with these experiences and learned many new things. But I wouldn't recommend.
And do you also know people who had very unhelpful experiences?
These experiences can be unruly, unpredictable. Sometimes it can be unruly and unpredictable in ways that we can learn from and benefit from, and sometimes unpredictable and unruly in ways which are hugely damaging to our minds, to the ways we go on to live and behave. And I know people who have had that kind of experience as well. When was the last time that you learned something very new about fungi? Today, and on Friday, when I was spending time with my amazing collaborators. And we have this astonishing way of watching the flows taking place within mycorrhizal fungal networks. So real time, you can see the contents of these networks. Because we think about these networks as, you think about them as the network, but they're tubes through which matter is flowing. And the flows within the network are the way that fungi are able to do what they do. And so in this situation, never before have I been able to see this. To see the flows within the network. And you see material moving in two directions at once. You see it sort of flowing down one way and changing direction and flowing the other way again. You see complex bundles of stuff that you have no idea what it is. Moving through these tubes, interacting with other bundles of stuff. It's just totally thrilling. And thrilling in part because it allows one to get a feeling for these organisms. A feeling for what they're doing in real time. And it's very hard to get that normally because they live out of sight. So in this process of looking at these flows and talking with the lab, I've been learning so much. Yeah, and I'm learning a lot factually about what they're doing, but also learning a lot qualitatively, intuitively about how they're behaving, getting a feeling for them, which I think is no less important.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid this is all we have time for now. When will we be able to buy the hot sauce? That's something.
Oh yeah, the hot sauce.
Can we buy that online?
Don't forget the hot sauce
hot
plug.
sauce,
My brother told me to do that. So me and my brother have just launched a line of fermented hot sauce, which will be available in a small, limited batch sometime before Christmas. And the best thing to do, if you're interested, is to follow Sheldrake Sauce on Instagram.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The live stream will end, I'm afraid, at 9 o'clock because we aren't allowed to live stream the performance. But could I please welcome to the stage Ramsey Nasr? He can.
Hello. Good evening, everybody.
Ramsey, maybe you can tell us a bit about what we're going to see, what we're going to hear, and why we're going to see and hear it.
Yeah, well, it's an. Thanks for having me, and hello, Mr. Sheldrake. It's actually a musical performance intertwined with poetry that I wrote, and Johan Idema and Frank Veenstra. Those are the two persons that brought us together in March to develop a musical poetical performance based on Waldzenen by Schumann. Waldzenen is a piano piece in 9 parts, and it has very romantic titles based on walking in the forest, the very romantic experience of enjoying a stroll in the forest. And they asked me to write a text on that adaptation, arrangement that had been made by Calefax, the rietkwintet, of that piano piece. So it was first transposed into a rietkwintet musical piece, and then Frank and Johan asked me to write the text, but more based on the wood wide web, so the modern stroll in the wood with all the knowledge that we have now about the wood that is actually invisible underneath the ground. And I've always been fascinated by the underdogs in the living in the world of life. So jellyfish, octopuses.
With the underdogs, you mean the organisms that we don't generally tend to like?
Yeah, not the elephants, not the orangutans.
Not the cute ones.
Not the huggable ones, at least. And also, for a reason, I mean, not just because they're underdogs, but because they approach life from a different perspective, and they change. Those are the animals and also the living creatures that change our perspective on life. Like we just heard on the fungi, how they teach us something about how we should relate to nature again. Octopuses do the same thing because they tell us something about intelligence. I mean, all 8 arms of the octopus have an independent mind of their own, so they act actually independent from each other. Jellyfish that has this changing episode of the. Yeah, I can go on and on about. Jellyfish are just so incredibly fantastic.
You could have been.
They're not bisymmetrical. They're radial symmetrical. It's a complete branch on their own, like lichens. To which
lichens. Yeah, we haven't even talked about lichens.
I'm a big fan of lichens.
Yeah,
korstmossen. Yeah. So I also collect lichens.
You do?
Yeah. Well, prints, old botanical prints of lichens. Yeah. So they found the right man to write this.
Definitely.
They asked me to write 9 poems, and we did that several performances in March, and now we were very honored to be asked
to have this.
by Spui 25 to Actually, it's sort of an, how to say, an homage to your book, because I loved the book, and it was not my sole source of inspiration, but it was the largest, by far the largest piece of inspiration, and it's a book that I will carry on with me for a long time. Already the cover is a piece of art, the cover of the book, so also the publisher really did a great job. Really, thank you so much for writing it, for making us witness of your knowledge. Thank you.
It's a beautiful book. Everyone who hasn't read it yet should really do that. It's,